For week 6, we will need, of course, your instructions. We will need your section 2 and your section 3 that you prepared in week 5. You'll need your quilt back, your block back. You'll need a strip of fabric 2 and 2 triangles of fabric 1. And if you're doing the optional batting, the wool batting, you'll need that. And of course you'll need some battleizer hooped up and ready to go. You'll need some wash away thread, regular embroidery bobbin thread, and your thread A for your needle and your bobbin. Let's get started. For step 1, I placed water soluble thread in my needle, and I have regular embroidery bobbin thread in my bobbin, and I've gone ahead and stitched out my placement stitch on my battleizer. Step 2 is for the optional wool batting, which I'm going to do. So I'll place that within my placement stitch and stitch step 2 with water soluble thread. If you're not going to use the wool batting, you can go ahead and skip step 2 and move on to step 3. For step 3, we're going to continue with the water soluble thread, and if you're able to, go ahead and raise the height of your presser foot, because as it travels over your wool, it'll help keep the foot from getting caught. For step 4, we're going to continue with the water soluble thread, and we'll take our smaller triangle of fabric 1 and we'll place it in this corner here. And I want my raw edge to be about 1/4 of an inch past that placement stitch, and then we'll tack it down. I have a little extra fabric here on the outside edges, so I'm going to trim that, leaving scant 1/4 inch, a little bit less than 1/4 inch. And now we're ready to do step 5. For step 5, I'm going to place my neutral thread in my needle only, and I'm going to take my strip of fabric 2 and put it right side to the last triangle, making sure that when I flip it up that I have enough to cover my whole area here. So you'll put it right sides together with your raw edges even and stitch the seam. For step 6, we will place wash away thread in the needle only, and we will flip fabric 2 right side up, smooth it out, and let the machine tack it down. For step 7, we'll change back to our neutral thread in the needle only, and we'll take our larger triangle of fabric 1 and we'll place it right side to the last fabric with our raw edges even, and we will stitch the seam. For step 8, we're going to change back to our water soluble thread in the needle only, and we'll take our triangle of fabric 1 and we'll flip it right side up and smooth it out, and the machine will tack it down. So next we're working on step 9, which is a match point, and we need to match this seam with this seam right here. So what helps me is to take a pin and put it right through where the match point is on your section 2, and then turn it over, and I use like a little friction pen with some color, and I make a small dot where that needle came out, and that'll help me line it up. So now that I have that dot marked, I will place my section 2 right side to the last section in the hoop, and I'll bring it over to my machine and show you how to line it up. So I've got the hoop attached to the machine, and I'm going to just lower my needle so you can see right where it goes down. It goes down right in that seam allowance. So what I'll do is I'll take my section 2, the 1/4 inch side with the blue mark, and I'll put that over the top of the piece section in the hoop, and I'll again lower my needle, placing it right at that blue dot that I made earlier. So once I get it into position, I just hit the start button, and it will take just a couple of tacking stitches. And then what we want to do before we actually do the next step, which would be the seam, is we want to check that and be sure it's going to match. So I'll just clip a few threads just to get them out of the way, and I'll flip this over and look at my match point, and it looks good. So I'm ready to go to step number 10, which would be to complete the seam. So I'll place this back right side up again. And what we want to do now is, because this moves a little bit, this section 2 will move, we want to lower the needle and get that needle to go right where your seam line is. The seam line is the basting line from section 2. So now that I have that aligned, I'll go ahead and stitch my seam. I'm going to slow my machine down, and when I get to my match point, I'm going to stop it. And the reason we stop it is because we want to make sure we have this end aligned. So if I turn it back, I can make sure that my two seam lines are laying on top of each other, and it would be the water-soluble basting line from section 2 plus the water-soluble basting line from the section that's already in the hoop. So once that I get that aligned, I let it finish the seam. And now let's back up a little bit. And before I sew my next step, I just want to make sure it looks fine, that it lines up. So we'll flip it forward and look at it, and I do see my basting lines are lined up here, they're lined up here, and my match point is also lined up. So I'm ready to do my next step. Step 11 is to change back to water-soluble thread in your needle only, and we'll flip our section 2 right side up. Pull it nice and snug because of the wool. We want to make sure it's nice and snug, and we'll let the machine tack it down. I still have a nice slow speed on my machine just so that I can keep ahead of where it's going to stitch and keep a little tension on my section 2. So now we're ready for step 12, which is a match point for section 3. So we're ready for the match point for step 12, and we need to change to our neutral thread in the needle only. And I've lowered my needle so that you can see right where the needle needs to go into the match point, and it needs to match up with this area here on section 3. And the next step actually is a match point down here. So I've taken my section 3 and I've made 2 small dots by putting the pin through like I did before, one here and one here. So I'm ready to go. So I'll lay my section 3 right side to what's already in the hoop and lower my needle right into the blue dot that I made. That's where it needs to go. And then I'll go ahead and let it stitch that match point. So that's step 12. Step 13 is another match point. And I'm going to lower my needle right on that little blue dot let it stitch that match point. Step 14 is the seam, but again, we're going to check our match points to be sure that they're perfect before we stitch the seam, because it's a lot easier to take out a couple of stitches than it is a whole seam. So let's move my camera back a little bit. Let's see how we did. I'm happy with the bottom one. The top one is pretty good. I think I'll go with it. So now I'm ready to put my hoop back on the machine. And I need to align my needle. Needs to drop right onto my seam allowance here. My needle is dropped right onto my seam allowance from my basting line from section 3. So that's in the right place. And now I'll stitch my seam. So my seam, or my machine, is still stitching very slowly. I'll let it stitch through that first match point. When it gets to the second one, I'm going to stop it, because what we need to do is turn back section 3 just a little bit and make sure that your two basting lines are laying on top of each other, which these are. And now that I'm happy with the position of that, I'll let it finish stitching my seam. So now that I've finished stitching my seam, let's check it out and see how it looks. Turn back this section, and I think it looks very good. So the next step is step 15. And for step 15, we want to place water-soluble thread in our needle only and let the machine baste down section 3. Here's a look at my block front ready to go. So we're up to step 16, which is to place the back on. So I'm going to turn my hoop over, place my block back over my stitching, and continue with the water soluble thread and baste the back of my block on. Step 17 is our final step, and we will place thread A in the needle and the bobbin and do the quilting. A couple of tips before beginning your quilting. If you haven't already done so, turn off your automatic thread cutter on the machine. And the second tip is to use your needle up down and bring your bobbin thread up to the top. And hold on to your top and bottom thread when you begin quilting. That way you won't have a bird's nest on the back of your block, and you'll have a nice clean back. So after I sew a couple stitches, I can stop and clip those threads and keep going. So this block is ready to trim up. Before we trim it though, we need to talk about the placement of this particular block, especially if you are not doing the optional border. I'm going to put the optional border on my quilt, but I'll trim this one up as if I was not doing it. We'll pretend this is block A, which will be the very corner of the quilt. And you'll notice there's two red areas here, and those are the two areas that I need to trim my block 1/4 inch through all the basting lines. So that would be this one and this one. So I like to do those first, so I'm going to turn it this way. I'll take my Trimmer by George and I'll turn it over so that I have my ruler side up. And this side's going to get binding So I'm going to trim 1/4 inch through all layers. On this side as well as this side, because this is where my binding is going to go. So this would be the corner of my quilt, and then these two sides get attached to blocks within the quilt. So what we do is we turn back our top of our block, we take the metal edge of our trimmer and shimmy it up to the block, making sure we have no fabric peeking out, and then we rotary cut the battleizer and the backing completely off. And we'll do that on these two sides. So I'll turn back the block front, make sure there's no fabric poking out, rotary cut that off. And now, so what I have on the back is I have a corner for my binding, and I have two corners that are ready for me to, that I've removed the backing and the batting. And these two corners I need to turn over my ruler again and rotary cut 1/4 inch from the basting line. So this would be block A. Block B, I would just do the 1/4 inch just on one side, and so on. So we'll just go ahead and follow your instructions, and if you're not doing the border, you'll be all ready to go. So here's a look at our mystery quilt for 2016 in the beginning. I hope you loved it as much as I enjoyed showing it to you. So the completed blocks are week 1 and 2, week 3 and 4, week 5 and 6, and of course I've got the optional border on. So hope you enjoyed it again, and we'll see you next year.